Okay. So, okay. So we were talking about this moment in the history when Aristobulus and his brother had to go and see the Roman general. What was his name? Pompey. Everyone pronounces that different. I think Pompey is actually the correct pronunciation. There's a city called Pompeii, and then there's Pompey, but I always end up saying Pompey for both of them. So anyone who makes that mispronunciation, I certainly do sympathize with. So Pompey, or Pompey, was coming down. What would the year be approximately here? 63 BC. So it's really 100 years after Judas Maccabee. So it's hard to picture that 100 years have gone by. But we did have Judas succeeded by his brothers, Jonathan, killed under curious circumstances, Simon, also killed under curious circumstances, but Jonathan's children, I think, seem to have died with him or something. Anyway, Judas doesn't seem to have had any offspring, even though one of the books said that he settled down. But we don't have any indication. I think he is a holy warrior as such. Something like the Dead Sea Scroll people. I don't think the Dead Sea Scroll people that will, by the way, next lecture I will start on the scrolls with you, no matter how far I get here today. I don't think the scroll people were in the wilderness, as it were, because they were contemplatives or ascetics, if you know what I mean. I remember when we used to do college boards, we could try to increase our vocabulary. So we'd have books that would have words you were liable to encounter, and one of the words was always like ascetic. We didn't even know what the word meant when we were young, younger than you guys are now. But an ascetic is someone who is a meditative, retiring, contemplative, apolitical, out of society sort of, well, dedicated to a retiring lifestyle. I don't think that the Dead Sea Scroll people are like that. That's our view of what we think they would have been because of our view of Essenes, if you like. We think of Essenes as being ascetics, purely contemplative types in the wilderness. We don't think of John the Baptist as violent, although what comes from his mouth, even in the New Testament, is pretty violent. And when someone is militant, they tend to work people up. So he tends to be provocative, John. So he's not really an ascetic even in the New Testament. And in Josephus, he's clearly pretty provocative. And his ideas are very close to the Dead Sea Scrolls, as we'll see. In fact, I'm sure that how many people in the wilderness were running around at that time? You know, I don't know if you saw Monty Python, Life of Brian. Yeah. I mean, look, if you have people like that running around like Life of Brian, if you've seen it, I mean, how many could there be out there in the middle of nowhere? They all knew each other. They all knew about each other. It's a very small place. It's like going out to Death Valley. I mean, you know, if there's a bunch of crazies digging for gold in one place, you think the other people, a mile away don't know that they're there and don't know what they're doing? Of course, they all knew each other. They were all part of the same mindset or thought process. So I think if you defined any of them, you've basically got them all. Well, I don't think so. Oh, John thought this, but the guy in the neighboring cave, he thought something else. I mean, come on, let's get real about this. Let's try to think of it as real things. So, I think that these people, if we judge from the literature of the Dead Sea Scrolls, as we're going to do now, are militant. And they're not out there because they're meditative. They're preparing the way of the Lord, literally, as the New Testament says. But they're not preparing the way for a Pax Romanum, Emperor Augustus spin-off. You know, they don't even know about Augustus or the Pax Romanum or anything like that. They're out there preparing in purity for the coming of the heavenly host and the angels. And the angels are aggressive angels. They're militant angels. They're going to fight a war of the sons of light against the sons of darkness, and they're going to destroy all evil on the earth, including the Roman Empire. It's a little bit like Bin Laden, a little bit like Al-Qaeda, though I don't want to compare them to Al-Qaeda. So I'm sure the Muslims look upon Bin Laden the way these people would have looked upon the righteous teacher. Now that we live in a world that has these kind of people running around, I think you get a better idea. I don't think these people are suicide bombers necessarily, although the picture in Maccabees 2 is people who are willing to commit suicide rather than surrender and will fight till their last breath and so on and so forth. But I think they're mainly after righteousness. I would assume that the Al-Qaeda militants think they're after righteousness, though I'm not sure if they really do think that. I don't know what they think they're after. They just seem to want to kill anyone who doesn't think the way they think. But in any event, I think the people out in the wilderness were a little more aggressive than you would imagine, and they were preparing themselves for a holy war. They were following an extreme purity regime, which in the most extreme cases meant eating only vegetables. Maybe they weren't so much pure foods people as they were eating only vegetables because, as I told you, the permission to eat meat had been withdrawn because the temple sacrifice was no longer functioning. And the temple sacrifice, according to Genesis and the Noah story, was what made it possible for you to consume meat and take animal life. And if the temple sacrifice was being carried out by corrupt priests, by priests appointed by Roman authorities, if you're a Christian, you know the Apocalypse, the whore of Babylon is fallen. If the priests are appointed by the whore of Babylon and its minions, for instance, Nero and people like that, you're going to accept the high priest appointed by someone Nero appointed? Are you really going to do that? Of course you're not. Not if you're really, extreme purity-minded person. You're not going to accept that. And that's what happened in this period. The problem was that we're dealing with terribly horrific people in Rome that we've glorified in Western history, but are in this period really, totally depraved. Hey, you want to maybe pick up? Totally depraved people. Sexual mores completely depraved as far as Palestine would be concerned. So totally polluted people. The governors that they sent out would be totally polluted persons as far as the people here were concerned. So you have a situation where you couldn't accept officials or high priests appointed by such persons. I think that's the ethos you'll find in the Dead Sea Scrolls when we come up on it. You read those; they're very sincere documents. They're very consistent. They're very harmonious. One document agrees with the next absolutely. It's not just some collection of crazy writings that don't agree with one another. It's not the literature of the period. It's the literature of a movement. So let's go back here to this situation here where we have the crucial moment. So Simon succeeds Jonathan, then all the descendants of the Maccabean family for the next 100 years. So Simon would die about 130 something. So from 160 to 130, 30 years have gone by in the first generation of Maccabees. Then Simon's son John Hyrcanus would take us down to about 100. Then John Hyrcanus' surviving son, who didn't, Alexander Onias, as we did last time, he takes us down to around the 70 period. That's how we're in the 70s here when this happened. Then his two sons, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, they're in the 60s. And in the 60s in Rome, we're getting the rise of Julius Caesar and Pompey. Julius Caesar is in Gaul, subduing the Gauls, and he's a fairly decent person, Julius Caesar, but he's ruthless. And he doesn't brook any opposition. If you oppose him, he's going to kill you. And he's going to make sure that none of you escape. And he did that to the famous Gaul leader. How many are familiar with the Roman history? What's his name? Vercingetorix, is that his name? Yeah, it's supposed to be some red-haired chieftain, and the town that he was in that they hold up there, and it's been on television a lot on the History Channel. If you watch it, I think it was called Elysium or something like that. It was a big, huge hill fortress. They outnumbered the Romans like, 10 to 1. But Caesar built a huge 25-mile wall around this mountain and somehow managed to wall them in. And finally, I don't know how he did it, through very clever stratagems. In any case, he either killed or captured them all and captured their chieftain. He took this chieftain to Rome, and he respected him. But when the victory parade came, he had him beheaded or killed with an axe in the victory parade. You didn't surrender to Rome lightly. You didn't surrender to Rome lightly. So this is a great pity here. What happens is that the Romans are coming in the eastern part. Caesar's in the west, Pompey's in the east, and he's coming down fighting the Persians, who are at this time called the Parthians. And he comes in from the north. He's in Asia Minor, subduing, the Armenians have had a tough time from then until now, subduing the Armenians, and they made, colonies out of the Armenians and other countries in Asia Minor. These were still Greek-speaking places. The Kurds have got the short end of the stick from the beginning of time to the end of time. The Kurds were in the mountains there, The name of the place that the Kurds inhabited at that time was called Adiabini. We're going to end up in this class in my books with the person who was the queen of Adiabini, and her name is Helen. And I think her sons or grandsons or family, according to, I make that point in my New Testament code, they're going to be involved in the final war against Rome from 66 to 70, and I think she helped finance it. I think she's the person who Acts calls the Ethiopian queen. There was no Ethiopian queen at this time. Acts is playing games with us there. She did send her treasury agents to Jerusalem to relieve the famine. We know that. And we know that they went down to Egypt and they went out to Cyprus and bought grain in the 40s and 50s. So Queen Helen and northern Iraq and southern Asia Minor, northern Syria, and so on. Those were the Kurds. They weren't called Kurds then, but they've always got the short end of the stick from the whole of time. And they're still getting it. The Turks now are going to come in and crush them if they can, and so on, because we're so distracted. We have no power anymore to prevent any of these things. In any event, all those areas Pompey is subduing at this moment. And he comes down through Syria. And you think he's going to stop at Palestine? Of course not, he's not going to stop at Palestine. He's on his way to Egypt. And so the intermediary here is Antipater. And who's Antipater? The father of Herod to be. His name is Antipater. And he arranges for Hyrcanus, as we did last time, to get Roman help. Hyrcanus I would be John Hyrcanus. Hyrcanus II is the son of Alexander. I always had two names by this time, Hebrew and Greek. John is a Hebrew name, Hyrcanus is a Greek name. Alexander is a Greek name, Yanez is actually Jonathan. It's actually a Hebrew name. They took Greek and Hebrew names by this time. Aristobulus II. Aristobulus I was a son of John Hyrcanus. Aristobulus II is the brother of Hyrcanus II, and his name would have been Judas Aristobulus. So they took a Greek and also Hebrew names. In any case, Pompey is coming down into the country here, and as we said, Hyrcanus makes a deal with him through help from Petra. Where's Petra? If you remember, I drew you a map, but I'll do it again. This is Palestine. This is the Dead Sea, what we call Transjordan. It wasn't as clearly demarcated as that in those days. Syria, Jordan, although it wasn't Jordan then, it was Idumea. And so on and so forth. But Petra is over here. And the Arabs were just coming into prominence here. So this is an Arab king here, an Arab capital here. And if you remember the John the Baptist story, he's pushing up here, at least in Josephus' view. And Paul has to escape Damascus in the New Testament because of the representatives of this Aretas fellow, who was the king of Petra. They were all called Aretas. Now this is 100 years after the period we're talking about, but it would be Aretas the third, Aretas the fourth, Aretas the fifth, Aretas the sixth, and so on. So that's why they're all called Aretas, the kings of this Petra place. The Arabs are getting stronger in Transjordan, and then Herod's father, Antipater, is a Greco-Arab with ties to the Arab dynasty in Petra, and he makes connections with the Romans, and Hyrcanus is a weak person and allows him to basically make Hyrcanus a stooge of the Romans. Meanwhile, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus have fought a war together, a mini war, according to your Josephus here. And who won? Aristobulus, even though he's the younger brother. And who does the mother support? Hyrcanus, because he's the older son and he's in not a lot of trouble and he's more Pharisee-minded. And she is, what's her name? Salome Alexander. She too has two names. So she, I'm sure she likes both of her sons, but she knows that her older son is popular with the Pharisees. And she's from a Pharisee family, apparently. And her brother is a famous Pharisee father who this gentleman can tell you about because he knows the Pirkei Avot, I'm sure. And this is Simeon ben Shetak, that's her brother. And once Alexander dies, and he would be a kind of Sadducee, purist Sadducee or revolutionary or nationalist Sadducee at that time, she takes the part of the Pharisees, and the Pharisees promote Hyrcanus. And I told you, in my view, those are the people willing to live with foreign power. Many extreme rabbinic groups to this day are willing to live with foreign power. There are some Hasidic groups in Israel who prefer the king of Jordan or the Palestinians to the Israel government because they don't like things that are done in what they consider, if Jews do it in an impure way, they don't approve of that. But if someone else behaves in an impure way, for them it is not important. So they're just as would rather live under foreign rule than risk incurring any, it's not, I mean, I understand how they think, but I don't think that that is particularly, how should we put it, particularly a kind of position that would make you feel proud of somebody. I'll put it that way. I mean, it's hard to feel that you'd be proud of, you know, if Himmler or Hitler or someone were around and you'd be willing to live under such a person rather than your own people because you felt that things were impure or so on. And, you know, they went, Yasser Arafat, people like that, they were quite willing to live under his authority rather than their own people. Okay, I understand that, but it's still not something that it's hard to really understand that. That's extreme Pharisee position, I think, come rabbinic Judaism. But the Phariseeism here is clearly they are always willing, they don't want foreign power, but they're willing to live with it. They're willing to accommodate themselves to it. The extreme other nationalist groups are not. So this is the moment when Aristobulus too refuses to humiliate himself before Pompey, and he, in order to secure his ends, as Josephus puts it, and turns back. Later on, Aristobulus did try to make some accommodation and did go out to meet Pompey. What happened to him at that moment? A couple of paragraphs later on. Pompey took him prisoner. And then he gets involved in the war between Pompey and Caesar. You know, Pompey and Caesar fought a war at this time for control of Rome, a little after this. Why is Caesar assassinated? Do you know your Roman history? What's the date I told you of Caesar's assassination? 44 BC. This would be about 20 years after the events here. About 10 years after this, Pompey and Caesar make a deal that they're going to sort of rule together. But they fall out and fight a war. And Pompey ultimately is defeated in Greece. It's covered in the Roman historians. And he's killed in Egypt when he flees. And when Caesar pursues into Egypt, they give him Pompey's head, thinking that they'll conciliate Caesar. But he's very upset by that. He doesn't like people to be treated like that. And he kills the people, he executes the people who did this to, even though Pompey was his opponent. He was related to him by marriage. They used to secure their relationship by marriage. All that, by the way, as I told you earlier, is in the Rome series on HBO the first year. If you look at that Rome series, all those events are part of the background to the sort of upstairs-downstairs situation. In other words, they follow some Roman legionaries in that battle, but they also follow the squabbles of the powerful people against, and the Roman legionaries are for you to relate to on a personal level, but the powerful people are, the historical events are fairly good. So that's this period here, 60s to 50s BC. Well, so what happens to Aristobulus' supporters in the temple? This sets the stage for our period. They, as Josephus tells you, even though, by the way, Josephus is writing from sources, as we said last time here. But this, I think, is one of the most beautiful parts of his book. While the Romans were suffering severely, Pompey was amazed at the unshakable endurance of the Jews, especially the maintenance of all their religious ceremonies in the midst of a storm of missiles. Just as if deep peace enfolded the city, the daily sacrifices, offerings for the dead, every other act were meticulously carried out. Not even when the temple was being captured, they were being butchered around the altar did they abandon their service. What if you were a conquering army and you saw people behave like this? You would be full of admiration. That's what I mean. Pride or admiration for people's sacrifice. This is really, so these are the most zealous, if you want to call it, or at least purity-minded group. I would call them purist Sadducees, if you want to use a term that doesn't exist here. Josephus, but he gets this from sources. I told you last time I remember the name of the sources. Nicolaus of Damascus is one of the sources. He mentions it. Nicolaus of Damascus. And Strabo, the Greek historian, the Greek geographer, is another of his sources. He's like you. He's using sources. This Nicolaus of Damascus is is a Herodian diplomat who goes to Rome to represent Herod when Herod is king and so on. And he writes, like a lot of these intellectuals do. And so Josephus comes later. So whoever wrote this obviously saw this. And they are full of admiration for it. And the Romans were full of admiration. They put the service of God before their own preservation. And that's what Maccabees 2 is talking about. And most who fell, however, were killed by the countrymen of the rival faction. And we said already that those were Pharisees. Okay, so as the situation develops, what happens to Aristobulus here? His supporters are either butchered or killed or subdued or whatever. You know, if you read the Antiquities, which is a parallel account. It's more detailed. And in that account, a figure named Honi the circle drawer is mentioned. Did we do him last time? No. Honi the circle drawer is with the hold-up people in the temple after Aristobulus is arrested by the Romans. At this time, the Romans aren't really being vengeful to foreign kings. What do they do with Aristobulus? They end up sending him to Rome as a prisoner. And when Caesar takes over, he treats him with the marks of respect because he sees him as a Jewish king. And he doesn't disrespect him for that. It's all in these books, the Antiquities and this. He has two sons, Antigonus and Alexander. I think the first, Alexander, Josephus tells us, is almost beheaded immediately. Now, you should trace the beheadings in Josephus. Josephus watches the beheadings. I don't think he misses many of them. So if you've got a beheading in the New Testament, I'm pretty much sure that it would have a parallel in Josephus. So if someone is beheaded in the New Testament that isn't beheaded in Josephus, probably the New Testament has maybe changed someone's name, perhaps. And that's my point of view on the beheading of James, the brother of John. It's in the book of Acts that Herod beheaded James, the brother of John, with a sword. It's about chapter 8, but weird enough for it, or 9 or 10. In the same chapter, the book of Acts tells us that. What happens? It introduces another James it never told us about. James, the brother of Jesus. It gets rid of one James and introduces the next James. Well, in my work that I have, it's very complicated and hard to understand, and I admit that. Josephus tells us in the Antiquities about a Theudas who was beheaded in this time. And I think that this Theudas is actually, to my mind, Judas. Theudas is Judas Thomas, probably. Thaddeus in the New Testament. Theudas to you folks. Too complicated to work out here, but if you look at my New Testament code, I try to work it out for you. But sometimes things are moved slightly sideways in the New Testament's account because some of these things are a little bit embarrassing, let us say, to the authors who are reworking some of the material from this period. But let's go back. That's why I think you have to watch all the beheadings. This is the first one. Alexander is beheaded because he doesn't accept this situation. He escapes from Pompey's hands, and he's finally retaken, and he's beheaded. Why would someone be beheaded in this period? Beheading is the Jewish punishment for subversive, insurrectionary, revolutionary activity. Crucifixion is the Roman punishment for this. Sometimes the Romans also behead, but mostly from the time of Spartacus onwards. Spartacus would be about 80 BC. They crucified people for this kind of behavior. Crucifixion is an exemplary punishment to tell other people, if you step out of line like this, this is what's going to happen to you. You've probably heard and seen the movie Spartacus, or heard of it. Spartacus was a gladiator in around 80 BC who led a slave revolt, a gladiator revolt against the Roman army, and beat about 3 or 4 Roman armies before he was finally defeated by the overwhelming might of the armies the Romans were finally able to muster. But they really never defeated him in battle, I don't think. He wanted to flee across the Alps, but he was so successful in Italy, his gladiator soldiers were so successful that they prevailed upon him to stay in Italy and keep on, sacking the place. And finally the Romans caught up with him. But he would have escaped if it were up to him. In any case, the Roman historians tell you that there were so many crucifixions that occurred at that time that the whole road from Naples to Rome were filled with crosses. So if you came to Rome at that time, you'd see these people rotting on these crosses. They didn't take them down. They just let them rot there for months and months and months until they're just skeletons hanging from the crosses. So that you would know what? You better watch out. You better watch out. Now, we only know one crucifixion. Believe me, there were hundreds of thousands probably. I mean, we just don't understand the history of this period. And in Palestine, I think there were tens of thousands. I think there were tens of thousands of crucifixions. At one time, Josephus mentions that Felix crucified so many people. Felix is a person who appears in the book of Acts, talking very friendly with Paul in Acts about 23, 24, 25, and so on, before he goes back to Rome. Felix was, I think, Nero's freedman, or the previous emperor may have been Claudius's freedman. I think it was Nero. In any case, he was there to, squeeze money out of the place, and he married one of the Herodian princesses. That's in the Antiquities too, and her name is Drusilla. She appears in Acts, and Drusilla. Josephus tells us in the Antiquities that a person, a magician called Simon, objected, or no, not objected, advised her and Felix that it was okay to marry each other. In other words, Simon Magus, famous character in the New Testament, is the person behind the marriage of Felix and Drusilla. All of you can find out if you read Josephus carefully. And he goes to Rome with them. All of that in Christian tradition about the confrontations in Rome with Peter and all that sort of thing. It all comes out of the Josephus material. And he is someone who is advising people to abandon the customs of their ancestors. And the weird thing is that Josephus makes it very clear that this Drusilla, who is also a Herodian princess with some Maccabean blood, as you'll see if you read this carefully, this Drusilla is abandons the traditions of her forefathers, as Josephus puts it in the Antiquities at one point. Even he puts it there at that point. Yet in the book of Acts, they don't identify her as a Herodian. They call her Drusilla a Jewess. Drusilla a Jewess. That's just exactly what she wasn't. That's exactly what she wasn't, a Jewess. She had left the Jewish religion in order to marry Felix, the Roman governor. But the point I'm making is that at one point in the Josephus works, that's why I have to read it carefully, Josephus says, he crucified so many people that there wasn't enough wood for the crosses or room to hang them all up upon. So this is in the 50s. So there's a lot of crucifying going on in this period. And with the war, after the fall of Jerusalem, you can be sure that several thousand, if not tens of thousands of people were crucified from the prisoners outside of the city there, the ones that weren't sold into slavery or taken to Rome for fun and games, to play with the animals or to do the gladiatorial contests or all the good times. Josephus said they had birthday celebrations for Domitian in Beirut and other places along the way back home to Rome with all of the prisoners that they had birthday parties in the arena for them to fight the animals and each other and that kind of thing. These are really, very gruesome people. Really very gruesome people. You at this time would have no choice but to fight and die if you were an honorable person, or flee. In any event, so Alexander's the first one beheaded. Then Aristobulus, his brother, his father, escapes from Rome. And on the way back, the people loyal to Pompey, no, I think they send him back again. They capture him and send him back again. So he survives still. He's in chains or under a certain arrest in Rome. Then later on, Crassus gets the governor of Syria, governorship of Syria, so you can try to follow this, and he does steal treasure from the temple, according to this, in order to do campaigning in the east against the Persians. Anyway, then Josephus mentions when Pompey and the Senate fled across the Adriatic, Caesar became master of Rome. There we can meet in our different translations. And this is 55 BC. He at once released Aristobulus from prison. And that's where it is. But on the way back, he was poisoned by Pompey's adherents. But he wasn't able to be buried at that time. So they preserved his body in honey out of some respect for him. And later on, I think he was sent back to be buried. It's all in here. This is pretty accurate stuff. Why would they preserve his body in honey? Well, that would be the best preservative they had. And then they would be sent back and so on. So Pompey is mentioned here. At this time, after Pompey is killed in Egypt, Antipater changes sides and courts Caesar. Who's Antipater again? The fellow who brought the Romans in the first place. The one with Arab contacts. He's a kind of middleman between the foreign powers and the Maccabean family. He's an intermediary person. He's Hyrcanus's, he's the power behind Hyrcanus's high priesthood. Later on, he becomes the first Roman governor in Palestine. Antipater becomes the first Roman governor in Palestine. He changed sides. And at the end of that first chapter then, it said that Caesar bestowed Roman citizenship upon him. Who? Antipater. Why? Because of services to Rome. He's a perfect Roman bureaucrat or someone they could use. Now, Hyrcanus is still there, but if you read further on, we won't have time to do that. I'll just do a little bit of Herod's rise to power here, and then we'll stop for the exam that we're going to have. But if you read along further in the Josephus thing, you'll see that Josephus spends an inordinate amount of time on Herod's marriage to Mariam, who was a Maccabean princess, a granddaughter of this Hyrcanus, and Aristobulus both. You can look at the marriage lines there. So all the Maccabean hopes were in her, and he forcibly married her. Then he, by chapter 4, Herod's murder of Mariam and her children, that's the first Mary. And then he finally murders his own, another son of his, who he doesn't feel is up to snuff, and so on and so forth. So that would take you all the way down to the time of the birth of Jesus, around the beginning of the 1st century. Those chapters about Herod's relations with his wives, his offspring, and so on. Herod had 10 wives. If you look in the back of the genealogies in your book, you usually have a genealogy. You'll see the different ones and who they were. Most of them were non-Jewish. 2 of them were daughters of priests, both called Mariam, or Miriam, or Mary. The first Mariam, a Maccabean high priest. The second one, a high priest from Egypt that Herod imported from the temple that we started this Jewish war mentioning, that there was a temple that Onias, a different Onias, but one of the early high priests before the Maccabees, had fled to Egypt and founded a temple in Heliopolis. Now he's going to end by discussing the destruction. The whole Jewish war will end with discussing the destruction of that temple also by the Romans. Because what happens in that temple at the end of the Jewish war, you won't get there, but I mentioned a little last time, I think. What happens there? The Sicarii, the extreme nationalist zealot party, the party that commits suicide on Masada. Masada is the fortress by the Dead Sea. That rather than surrender to the Romans, they held out till 73 after the temple fell, and then everyone committed suicide there. Men, women, and children. 1,000 people. Rather than surrender. And they're called Sicarii in Josephus. extreme zealots. Why Sicarii? Because they obviously they had an Arab dagger, like Arabs still wear on their chest, a curved dagger, and that was like the Roman short sword called a sika. And Josephus portrays that as being used to assassinate collaborators and opponents. So in the end of my New Testament code, I think it's perhaps more for other purposes. And we'll see that it may have to do with forcible circumcision. In other words, a different version of Josephus that came down through Christian hands under the name of a Christian theologian in the 3rd century called Hippolytus of Rome. It says there were 4 groups of Essenes. That's not what this Josephus says. There were normative Essenes, there were zealot Essenes, and there were Sicarii Essenes. So we don't normally think of them as being Sicarii Essenes. And what the Sicarii Essenes did is they would kill anyone they heard discussing the law who had not previously converted to Judaism through circumcision. I'm not advocating this, I'm just saying what their position was, according to that book. Now, I think that's very insightful in this period. And so I think the Sicarii are more than just assassins. They also said that they would offer them circumcision or death, a little like the Muslims do in some ways, even to the present day. I think the Muslims are inspired by a lot of this, good or bad. I'm not judging it. But again, I think that we have some indications after the surrender of the Roman garrison, when the uprising in 66 AD occurred, that they offer the Roman commander this choice, and he accepts circumcision rather than be killed. I'm not saying that circumcision should be done that way or not. I'm just saying that what these groups were advocating. Extremists are extremists at any time and place. But to call them simply assassins, I think, is not getting it exactly right. They feel that someone like Paul, for instance, should not be allowed to discuss the law if he was not first willing to come in under the law and be an heir to the law. That would be their position. I can understand that they would have thought that. You can't discuss someone else's religion. I think the Muslims feel this way to the present day. We can't discuss their religion. If we do, we risk what, who's the writer that had the death sentence put upon him, Salman Rushdie? Of course, he was a Muslim, and they consider him a backsliding Muslim. And as I told you at one point, there's no leaving Islam. The punishment for abandoning Islam is death. In theory, that doesn't mean they always do it. There are a lot of good Muslims, gentle Muslims, Muslims who want to just, be hospitable sort of people. But in the extreme case, this is the law. Every Muslim knows this, which is why very few people leave Islam. If they do, they go and hide someplace. Because it doesn't mean every Muslim is going to be after them. But what it does mean, if there's an extremist someplace, he can be after them. And he can say, like, they've given us the choice, according to the extreme Muslim ideologists, often say, well, we've offered you the choice of converting to Islam. You refused it, therefore we can out bond. If we can make 10 million casualties. It's in their websites. We can do 10 million casualties because we offered you, first gave you the choice. You didn't accept it. I mean, I don't remember having been given the choice, but it doesn't matter. You didn't accept it, therefore it's Islam or the sword. And people don't understand what they're dealing with in the extreme case. I'm not saying this is the everyday case. The extreme case is very, very difficult. And I think that's a little bit like this period, not quite the same, but similar. I don't think it's accidental that there is a connection there. I think it does come down through the traditions in some weird way. So we're looking at it a bit. So the Sicarii Essenes are the extremist groups. Now, Here we get that Caesar bestowed Roman citizenship on Antipater, and he made him a good lesson for all who, that gave him all the marks of friendship. And he also, for his sake, reconfirmed Hyrcanus in the high priesthood. But the next section talks about Antigonus. Antigonus is Aristobulus' second son. He too escaped from Rome, and he went to the Persians, and he got help from the Persians. And so he inherited from his father a craving for revolution and sedition, in the beginning of chapter 2. So Antipater is commissioner of all Galilee, of all Judea. That means he's governor. Hyrcanus, Josephus says, is lethargic and spineless. Herod, his son, has been appointed governor of Galilee, overflowing with energy. And he soon found it possible to express this, and he finds Hezekiah, a bandit chief, Josephus calls him, who was overrunning the district of Galilee in Syria. Hezekiah, that's a Jewish king name. So what's going on here? This would be in the 50s. Herod's father is governor of Palestine. Hyrcanus is high priest with no real secular authority. And it says here, the management of affairs had gone to Herod and his father, while Hyrcanus sat helpless, retaining only the name of king without any authority. And Herod put all these people to death that he captured in Galilee, in defiance of Jewish law. Even Josephus says it. They should have had a proper trial. So all of Herod's rise to power then is portrayed here. So he's not really Jewish. If he is, he's only superficially converted in some odd manner. And at one point, the Sanhedrin in Antiquities wants to put him on trial for the murder of this Hezekiah person, who's a bandit chief. Now, this Hezekiah person is not an unimportant person. Hezekiah, one of the last Jewish kings before the Babylonian captivity. It turns out that he's the father of someone mentioned in the New Testament called Judas the Galilean. So this is a royal line. And later on, the Antiquities mentions the sons of Judas the Galilean. In our language, James and Simon. And they're crucified by the Roman governors in 48 CE, a preventive crucifixion because they felt that they were going to cause trouble. Judas the Galilean in 4 BC to 7 AD, the time of the birth of Christ in the New Testament, is portrayed as the founder of the fourth philosophy, which becomes what we ultimately call the Zealot movement. Now, I think the Zealot movement has been around ever since Judas Maccabee, but it becomes an actual movement as such at the time of the death of Herod in 4 BC. So the reason I bring it up now is that this Judas, the Galilean, and Jesus, as you know, is a Galilean too, comes from Galilee. Galilee is the hotbed of revolutionary activity in this whole period for 100 years. This Judas the Galilean is the founder of this movement, and this Hezekiah is not just a bandit. Now, Herod's Josephus' source, or Josephus, likes to call these people thugs and bandits the way, for instance, China's communist propaganda back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s used to speak about the capitalist warmongers, bandits. We don't need foreign powers now to call us that. We have our own people here calling us that all of the time. The running dogs of capitalism and so on and so forth. It was normal in propaganda circles to refer to people like that, even in our own time. I don't think you have to read through Josephus and see that Hezekiah is not a bandit, he's a resistor. He's a resistance fighter with probably kingly pretensions. Anyway, he's executed, and now he's popular because the Sanhedrin wants to bring Herod to trial. That's in the Antiquities. And Herod comes into that Sanhedrin. That would be around 50s, 40s BC, armed, and dismisses the Sanhedrin. He's not even governor yet. Anyway, ultimately he is, his father does die, his brother is killed at one point. He has a brother called Phasael, Phasael, according to the Greek spelling. He is killed in some manner, an older brother, but that's an Arab name, Phasael. It's used to this present day all over the Arabian Peninsula, Phasael. In any event, he marries this Mariam, she's the daughter of Alexander, the one who was beheaded. That's who she is, the daughter of Alexander, the son of Aristobulus, who was beheaded. Well, anyway, Josephus goes into great detail about this. That's all in your chapter 2. And then he comes with the fact that at the end of chapter 2, this Antigonus is executed by Mark Antony. How come Mark Antony has any power here? Well, by this time, Caesar has been assassinated. Octavian, Caesar's nephew, and Antony originally ally themselves to fight Caesar's assassins, the Senate and so on, Brutus, Cassius, etc. And then they divide the empire up. Octavius cultivates the Senate again and changes his name to Augustus the Great. And Antony goes east because he wants Caesar's girlfriend, Cleopatra. You know, Caesar has a child by Cleopatra. It's all in that Rome series. What's that child's name? Caesarion. And why do we use the word Caesarion today? Oh, because we call it Caesarean section to give birth in this manner where you're not giving the natural birth. That's how he was born, apparently. So that's why to this very day we commemorate his name by calling our medical procedure Caesarean section. His name, that was Cleopatra's son by Caesar. When he was about 13, Antony was defeated. Cleopatra fled the naval battle, I forget where it was, off the coast of Greece. Was it Actium? At Actium off the coast of Greece. She fled back to Alexandria. He broke and followed her, and then I forget how he was killed on the way to her palace or something, and then she committed suicide and so on. But Caesarion hadn't died yet, and Octavian got him. Ultimately, she wanted to do everything to save Caesarion, but Octavian got him and he disappeared. Thrown down a well someplace or killed. Anyway, he was taken out of the picture. So in chapter 3 then, Antigonus is still going on here. He's not dead yet, but he has the support of the Persians and so on. Well, I can't go through this whole thing here except to get to the one section where Herod finally returns after the people rise up on Antigonus' side and the Persians come in, and this is the 30s because of the Roman, this is the 40s and the 30s because of the Roman Civil War that's going on. And Herod goes to Rome, gets Augustus' support this time, the way his father got Caesar's support 20 years before. This is in the 37 BC period. He goes to Rome. This is in this chapter, I guess it's chapter 3 or chapter 4 here. And once again, the people resist. And if you look at the Antiquities, the Pharisees want to open the gates to Herod the same way they wanted to cooperate with Pompey and so on and so forth. But once again, the people don't do this. And so finally Herod storms the city with Roman soldiers' help, a fellow called Sosius, who he came there with. And then at the end of this chapter, he's master of Palestine. and he, he beautifies all these architectural things, starts having Olympic Games, all this sort of stuff. But that's 37 BC, when Herod storms the temple. Now, just a final summation of that before we stop. In the first place, Pompey also stormed the temple. But he tells you in the Jewish War that he didn't, as we did mention last time, he didn't touch anything in the temple. He went in, looked at the treasure, but he wanted to conciliate the people, and he wanted Hyrcanus to be the high priest. He'd made a deal with him, so he didn't touch anything. When Herod storms the temple, he too doesn't want to offend the people because he wants to try to conciliate them in some way. So he pays his army, because the normal thing was the army would plunder the city. He pays the army, according to Josephus, out of his own pocket and doesn't disturb the temple. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls definitively say that the Kittim came or were coming and were going to or did plunder the temple and take all of the booty and so on and so forth. So I think it is pretty clear from the scrolls, and we'll do that when we look at the scrolls after this test here. It's pretty clear from the scrolls that this can't be the time of Pompey. It can't be 63 BC. It can't be Herod, 37 BC. It has to probably be 66 to 70 AD later on. That's a big dating problem for all the people working on the Dead Sea Scrolls. But I think it is comprehensible. And the one document that talks about this, which document is it? A document called Habakkuk Pesher, which I've done a lot of work on. I will do a lot of work on it with you afterwards. Habakkuk Pesher, Habakkuk Commentary. Makes it clear that the last priests of Jerusalem were destroyed, and that the temple and its treasure were given over to the army of the Kittim. Were given over to the army of the Kittim. So we'll look at that. Code next time. Now, before we take a break, and you